Well, let's get going here, and let's turn to Daniel chapter 1. A lot of that was just kind of some background discussion with regards to some of the critical issues. Well, we're going to see Daniel 1 through 6, as you know. I'm sure you've even studied this in church experience. Offers us some snapshots and some really pretty amazing, might say, heroic efforts behind the scenes. What do God's people do? What do the faithful of God do when the pressure gets turned up against them? So the lives of the faithful amongst the exiles. Daniel, as we've talked about before, is going to be part of the first deportation that arrives in and around 605 BC after the attack against Jerusalem under the king of Jehoiakim. So Daniel's going to be deported, and his friends. And like Joseph in Egypt, we see another example of Daniel and his friends serving in the court of the king. Let's just remind ourselves. And Taylor, I'm going to ask you to read starting in chapter 1, verse 1, down through about verse 7.
In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and laid siege to it. The Lord handed Jehoiakim, king of Judah, over to him, along with some of the vessels from the house of God. Nebuchadnezzar carried them to the land of Babylon, to the house of his God, and put the vessels in the treasury of his God. The king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his court officials, to bring some of the Israelites from the royal family and from the nobility, young men without any physical defect, good-looking, suitable for instruction in all wisdom, knowledgeable, perceptive, and capable of serving in the king's palace, and to teach them the Chaldean language and literature. The king assigned them daily provisions from the royal food and from the wine that he drank. They were to be trained for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to serve in the king's court. Among them, from the descendants of Judah, were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them other names. He gave the name Belshazzar to Daniel, Shadrach to Hananiah, Meshach to Mishael, and Abednego to Azariah.
So what's that in Veggie Tales? Rack, Shack, and Benny. What are their names? Yeah, you know Veggie Tales. Y'all know that? It's not.
Yeah, tickle the parsley.
Yeah. What? So, all right. We're going to see some of the challenges that are going to start to show up with regards to challenges to their faith and their obedience before the Lord. Look at verse 8. All right, we've got some coffee delivery. Come on in. No, you're fine. I know the line was long at the because of grindstone going on. People were getting coffee over there.
We were just jabbering.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
You're fine.
The line was long.
Yeah. I'll give you that. The line was long. Yeah, having to fight the crowd and all that. Verse 8, but Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank, so he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. He's also going to receive some unique wisdom and some unique skills down in verse 17. As for these 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. So this skill set that they're going to receive while in exile is going to come in handy. And we wonder if behind the scenes, if any of this news of God's provision will reach the exiles, will encourage somehow those in exile as well, hearing about God intervening and providing for some of these exiles who have found prominent positions in service. So like Joseph in Egypt, we're going to see that Daniel and his friends immediately will get caught in some crossfire. For example, Joseph with Pharaoh's wife. Daniel and his friends are going to get caught in the crossfire of this uninterpreted dream. Nebuchadnezzar is going to demand that the interpreters offer both the dream and the interpretation. So in response to this challenge, we'll see in chapter 2, verse 17 and 18, the appropriate response. Verse 17 in chapter 2. Then Daniel went to his house and informed his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, about the matter, in order that they might request compassion from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his friends might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. So what do they turn to? They turn to prayer, and the interpretation comes. And this particular interpretation comes to Daniel, and scholarly conversation now is going to basically focus on, with regards to this vision, which kingdoms are being referred to in this dream. So we have, again, the traditional conservative scholars that will interpret this dream as listing the following kingdoms. First, Babylon, then the Middle Persian or Medo-Persian, then to Greece, and then to Rome. So it ends with Rome. That's the traditional conservative scholars' position on this, which will put us in there nice and convenient with regards to the Roman period, then gets us to the Messiah and to Christ. Critical scholars will draw on we'll see first with the Babylonian kingdom, then Media and Persia, but then the last kingdom referred to will be Greece. So critical scholars are going to draw on this strong connection to this chapter 11 that we looked at earlier. And there the discussion is on Daniel's vision there that focuses on Antiochus Epiphanes IV and his turning up the persecution against the Jews at that time in 2nd century BC. So that's the connection that they make there. All right. However, traditional conservative scholars will see this vision as stretching out over history with a view to the final establishment of the kingdom that will end all kingdoms. That's the one that's going to endure forever. Look at chapter 2, verse 44. Chapter 2, verse 44. And after the vision and the explanation with regards to all the different periods, the divine kingdom, chapter 2, verse 44, and in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. And that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all of these kingdoms, but itself it will endure forever. That's kind of almost reminds us of Ezekiel's vision number 1 in chapter 1, when he was talking about whatever he was talking about, the living creatures and everything below, described in terms of, maybe pagan imagery, but then above that, and elevated above that, was the throne of Yahweh himself. So this may have been also an encouragement to the exiles. The net effect of this dream and its interpretation, we take a look at the effect that it did have on the king. Let's read that and go over to Damien. Why don't you read for us in chapter 2, verses 46 and 47.
The king Nebuchadnezzar fell down, paid homage to Daniel, and gave orders to present an offering and incense to him. The king said to Daniel, "Your God is indeed the God of gods, Lord of kings, and the revealer of mysteries, since you are able to reveal this mystery."
And then one more verse, verse 48.
Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many generous gifts. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and chief governor over all of the wise men of Babylon.
All right, so a lot of what happened with Joseph before, we see a similar thing happening as the Lord is intervening, and through this influence that's being had on these, in this case the Babylonian king, we see Daniel being promoted. We wonder if this would have had an impact on the exiles. So those in the exilic community at the time may have been reading the headlines of the day and being encouraged. God's at work. He's got our back, you know. We're here, we're waiting. The 70 years of predicted by Jeremiah haven't come about yet, but we're waiting for this servant, this Cyrus servant, to come on the scene, and that kind of a thing. But he's still working, as evidence. All right, so the impact that Daniel has on these pagan kings becomes a real focus in the whole book. And as I've anticipated and already kind of greased the skids a little bit, I think it has a lot to do with ultimately the first Persian king, King Cyrus, as we start to rev up what God's doing behind the scenes. Daniel chapter 3, speaking of impact on the kings, we see another beautiful example of faithful Jews, not Daniel in this case, but Daniel's friends, standing strong in the midst of this pressure that is being put on them with regards to worshiping in a pagan way. The Lord's going to provide protection for them. In chapter 3, they're not going to bow down to this image that's erected by the Babylonian king. And let's pick up in, chapter 3. Let's read verse 28 through 30. And go up to Jared. Why don't you read for us? Chapter 3, beginning of verse 28. How does Nebuchadnezzar respond to the aftermath of the fiery furnace?
Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants, who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their house laid in ruins. For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. The king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon.
So now his friends are being promoted as a result of this. Now we have to be careful and not make Nebuchadnezzar out to be having a hallelujah moment and running to the altar in the First Baptist Church of Babylon. Not quite, it's not quite what's happening here. Let's take a look and just recognize that, in chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, we see Nebuchadnezzar, the king to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language that live in all the earth. May your peace abound. It has seemed good to me to declare the signs and wonders which El Elyon, God Most High, has done for me. How great are his signs, how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. Pretty amazing statement, if you think about it, coming from the mouth of a pagan king. But in the pagan mind, you have to remember, they saw the gods active in every aspect of civilization. So I don't think Nebuchadnezzar is walking away from his pagan roots too quickly, but he is acknowledging the God of the Jews. He's kind of adding that God in with his overall response and recognition of all the gods that are at work. So I think that's an accurate assessment. We see certainly there's chinks, and impact that's being made. It may be over time, given some more impact and some more details, maybe Nebuchadnezzar would acknowledge with his whole heart, but not quite yet, I don't think. So this multiple gods, he's not announcing his exclusive allegiance to Yahweh in a monotheistic kind of way. That's my point. All right. Well, let's keep going here. From this chapter, we transition from Nebuchadnezzar to the last Babylonian king, so Belshazzar, in Daniel chapter 5. There's, from history and outside of the biblical context, we know that there's a series of Babylonian kings leading up to the fall of Babylon at the hand of Cyrus, the Persian king, in 539 BC, when Babylon collapses. Outside of the biblical context, we have the cylinder of Nabonidus, which will confirm this historical figure Belshazzar mentioned in Daniel 5, and that Belshazzar was the son of Nabonidus and co-ruler or co-regent with him. So that helps us to understand this is lining up well with the biblical context and Daniel's reference to Belshazzar as king in Daniel chapter 5, verse 1. Let's turn there and go ahead and read that, Seth. Chapter 5, verse 1.
King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, who drank wine in front of the 1,000.
Okay, so that's the reference there to Belshazzar. Let's see. I get my, let's see. All right, so okay. Oh, I see, chapter 5. I think I misreferenced my thing here. Get my wits about me here. Okay. What we're going to see here is Belshazzar's feast. And this is the account where there's handwriting that appears on the wall. Daniel's going to provide an interpretation. And we see that interpretation. Wait a minute. I think let's see, sorry about that. It's such a complicated, yeah, I'm looking at the vision of the tree. I kind of backtracked a little bit. That's kind of what threw me off. So chapter 4, verses 1. Chapter 5. Yeah, it's the chapter, let's see, 25. Okay. I guess, yeah, I'm in chapter 4, looking at the dream and Daniel's interpretation of this vision that he receives in chapter 4, beginning in verse 19. But over in verse 25, what we see is this interpretation where he says in verse 24, Daniel, "This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king, that you be driven away from mankind, and your dwelling place be with the beasts of the field, and you be given grass to eat like cattle, and be drenched with the dew of heaven, and 7 periods of time will pass over you until you recognize that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whomever he wishes." So what we see here is this is kind of this exilic experience that's being predicted here for the king, in this case, Nebuchadnezzar. So this results in verse 25b. Well, let's see. Let's move over to verse 26. And it was commanded to leave the stump with the roots of the tree. Your kingdom will be assured to you after you recognize that it is heaven that rules. So this is the interpretation that Daniel's given this vision. And it impacts the king with regards to God's kingdom will be the ultimate kingdom. Verse 27, "Therefore, O king, may my advice be pleasing to you. Break away now from your sins by doing righteousness, and from your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, in case there be a prolonging of your prosperity." So what we see later here with regards to Nebuchadnezzar in verse 33, the narrative continues to offer the account of an episode where the king did experience some kind of exile, personal exile. Verse 33. Let's see. Have John, could I have you read beginning in verse 33 in chapter 4?
Immediately the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from among men and ate grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven till his hair grew as long as an eagle's feathers, and his nails were like birds' claws. Nebuchadnezzar was... that's it.
Yeah, so that's the description of his exilic experience, whatever is going on there. And then the king responds with some level of humility. Keep reading in verse 34 down through verse 35.
In the end of days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me. And I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdoms endure from generations to generation. And all inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the host of heaven, and among the inhabitants of the earth. And none can stay his hand or say to him, what have you done?
And then verse 36 through verse 37, we have a restoration of health to the king. At that time, my reason returned to me, and my majesty and my splendor were restored to me, for the glory of my kingdom, and my counselors and my nobles began seeking me out. So I was reestablished in my sovereignty, and surpassing greatness was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven, for all of his works are true, and his ways just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride. So this is a significant thing as we continue to look at these events that are happening and the kinds of things that the Lord is doing behind the scenes to, in this case, grab the attention of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. Chapter 5, we're going to transition now quickly to Belshazzar, chapter 5, verse 1. So as I said earlier, he's the son of Nabonidus. According to that Nabonidus cylinder, he was put in charge of things while Nabonidus went off to have his leave of absence. So Belshazzar will rule in Babylon right up unto the fall of the Babylonian Empire at the hands of the Persian king Cyrus in 539 BC. And so Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian ruler, respected Daniel and issued decrees in favor of the God of the Jews in exile. Belshazzar, on the other hand, or in kind of opposite, will use the temple treasures for some kind of an orgy or some kind of party. Let's see. Anne, could you read for us in chapter 5, verses 1 through 3?
King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them.
So Daniel's not even going to be recognized by this Belshazzar. Let's read in verse 11 and 12. Keep reading there, Anne.
There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers.
Yeah, and one more, verse 12.
Because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar.
Belteshazzar, that's his name.
Let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation.
Okay, so this handwriting on the wall for Belshazzar is going to be interpreted by Daniel. And Daniel will deliver a message of judgment to this Babylonian king, that the inevitable is about to come. Over in chapter 5, beginning in verse 26, down through verse 28, Daniel's interpreting. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Peresh, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and Persians. So that's the message of judgment.
Interpretation of that is.
I'm sorry?
Many tekel in person.
Go ahead.
You've been weighed and found wanting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this Belshazzar is going to be, he's going to be the one who leads to the fall of the Babylonian Empire. All right, so let's see here. So verse 29, we have the transition. Let's see here. Could I have
What language is that? That was written on the wall.
I'm not sure. I don't know. Yeah. All right, back here, Ben. Why don't you read for us verse 29 and 30? Chapter 5. Finish out chapter 5 there, down through verse 31.
Then Belshazzar gave command, and Daniel was clothed with purple, a chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him, that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night Belshazzar the Chaldean king was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old.
Okay, so earlier we talked about those passages in this quick transition that Daniel gives us from Belshazzar, the Babylonian or Chaldean king, to our mysterious Darius the Mede. And I think that what we probably have here is really a reference to Cyrus the king, the Persian king, the victorious king, but referred to as and by Daniel by his more intimate name, Darius the Mede. So 539 is the first year of King Cyrus's first year to rule. And if he's going by two names, I think Daniel would have known that. And probably his audience would have known that as well. So all the way through chapter 6, verse 28, and we looked at that verse as well. We kind of have bookends to this this chapter 6, where we're really looking at the entire reign of King Cyrus, the Persian. And right in the middle of chapter 6, we have the precipitating event, another conflict that leads to the miraculous provision, Daniel in the lion's den, beginning in verse 16. Let's see, let's read verses 13 through 15. And Kristen in the back, why don't you read for us? Chapter 6, yeah, verse 13 through 15.
Then they answered and said before the king, Daniel, who is the one of the exiles from Judah, pay no attention to you, O king, for the injunction you have signed, but make his petition 3 times a day. Makes his petition 3 times a day. Then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed, and set his mind to deliver Daniel. And he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king, and said to the king, Know, O king, that it is law of the Medes and the Persians that no injunction or ordinance that the king established can be changed.
Okay, now verse 16 is interesting. Then the king gave orders, and Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you. It's interesting statement there from the king. If that's Cyrus the king there, if we're really looking at Cyrus the king all along here, what would have, what's interesting to me is the idea of the Lord working behind the scenes and getting the attention of these, in this case, this Persian ruler, and the anticipation. You see, verse 19, the king arose with the dawn at the break of day and went in with great haste to the lion's den. And when he had come near to the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth. So you know the story, but what's really interesting is how we see the impact of this event having on this Persian ruler, I would argue. And then we have his decree in verse 25. Let's have Ian. You're still here. Read verse 25 down through 28, chapter 6.
Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian.
And that's that verse that I referred to earlier that might be interpreted. So this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius, that is, in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So referring to the same person, and here Daniel is giving us his explanation. I've been talking about Cyrus all along, just referring to him by his median name, that is Darius. Let's take a 5-minute break, and we'll come back for the home stretch.